Welcome to your ultimate study guide. If you're a focused learner looking to truly wrap your head around how American society transformed after World War II, well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're bringing decades of complex history to life using just the absolute most essential concepts. So instead of getting bogged down in endless reading, we're going to break down all this history into a really clear cause and effect map. By the end of this explainer, you'll see exactly how the domestic shifts of the 20th century basically forged the modern United States we live in today.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be looking at 5 core areas to understand this massive transformation. First up, the post-war boom and migration. Second, the expansion of rights. Third, everyday impacts on students and the environment. Fourth, modern immigration shifts. And finally, economic shifts in healthcare.
Before we zoom into the really specific impacts of these eras, let's take a quick bird's-eye view of this timeline. Just look at the momentum here. We go from the truly groundbreaking Brown versus Board decision in 1954 to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, moving right through the expansion of rights with Roe v. Wade and the ADA, all the way to modern legal battles like the Affordable Care Act and the Dobbs decision in 2022. You know, this isn't just some random list of dates. It's a continuous, constantly evolving story of American policy.
So, Section 1. Post-war boom and migration changing the map.
Let's kick things off with some absolutely crucial vocabulary. First, you've got the GI Bill. This provided just incredible benefits for returning veterans, opening up access to college, job training, and housing. But to understand the physical transformation of the country, we have to look at the Eisenhower interstate highways. These massive new roads literally paved the way for suburbanization. The middle class expanded, and millions of people migrated straight from urban centers out to these newly built suburbs. This forever changed the American landscape, though it did unfortunately leave higher poverty rates behind in many urban areas.
Now, what's really interesting here is how a demographic explosion from decades ago directly impacts us right now. We're talking about the baby boom, which is that massive generation of kids born right after World War II, between 1946 and 1964. But listen, this is definitely not just a historical footnote. Because of the sheer size of this generation, their aging process today creates some very serious, long-term funding concerns for programs like Social Security and Medicare. Keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to see it pop up again when we get to modern healthcare.
As families grew and moved around, so did entire industries. On one hand, we have the Rust Belt. These were older Northeast cities and states that experienced some severe economic decline as people and businesses basically packed up and left. And where did they go? The Sun Belt. This was a massive migration of people moving down to warmer southern states like Florida, Texas, Georgia, and Arizona. This completely shifted the economic and political power map of the entire United States.
Moving on to Section 2, the expansion of rights beyond the civil rights movement.
It's absolutely essential to acknowledge that the monumental successes of the African American civil rights movement, led by icons like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Fannie Lou Hamer, really laid the vital groundwork for the modern era. The dismantling of Jim Crow laws, along with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, taught other marginalized groups how to organize, how to protest, and how to demand equal protection under the law. Building right off of that, and fueled by Betty Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique, along with the National Organization for Women, or NOW, the women's rights movement secured some massive policy shifts. We saw the Equal Pay Act demand equal pay for equal work. Title IX was a real game changer because it banned discrimination in educational programs, which radically transformed women's sports. And then in 1973, Roe v. Wade federally protected a woman's right to choose abortion. That was a landmark ruling that remained fiercely debated until it was eventually overturned by the Dobbs decision in 2022. But it wasn't just the women's movement. Other groups mobilized rapidly during this time too. For instance, the occupation of Alcatraz marked the fiery start of the Native American rights movement. And later, we see the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, an incredibly important piece of legislation that banned discrimination and legally required physical accommodations in public spaces. All of this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scope of this era's activism. You can really see how varied these movements were. The American Indian movement fought against broken treaties. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers led the Chicano movement to secure better wages and conditions for Latino laborers. The Stonewall riots in 1969 ignited the modern LGBT movement's push for equal treatment. Basically, everyone was organizing to secure their own specific, direct legal protections.
All right, Section 3, Students and the Environment, Everyday Impacts.
If you're a student right now, these next court cases are actually super relevant to you. First up, Tinker v. Des Moines firmly protected students' rights to free speech, famously stating that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. But on the flip side, New Jersey v. TLO set a strict limit. It ruled that schools are legally allowed to search students under certain conditions, just to maintain a safe environment.
Meanwhile, outside the classroom, the actual physical environment of the country was becoming a major political issue. Just like Betty Friedan's book sparked the women's movement, Rachel Carson's alarming book Silent Spring woke the public up to the severe dangers of pesticides. This single piece of writing set off a direct chain reaction. It spurred the creation of sweeping federal environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and it led directly to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce them all.
Let's turn to Section 4, Modern Immigration Shifts, Opening the Doors.
We really need to highlight one of the most transformative laws in modern history, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. See, prior to this, America had strict quotas based on national origin that heavily favored Northern Europe. This act abolished those restrictions entirely. That immediately and drastically increased both the total volume of immigration and the overall diversity of the United States.
So we can beautifully contrast two major approaches to immigration policy here. You have the 1965 Act, which was entirely focused on opening doors, specifically to immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But then, 2 decades later, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 shifted the focus. It attempted to manage the rising issue of illegal immigration by strengthening border enforcement while simultaneously offering a path to amnesty and citizenship for some undocumented immigrants who are already living in the country. And that brings us to Section 5, Economic Shifts in Healthcare, the Modern Debate.
So, how exactly did the federal government's economic role shift from the 1960s to the 1980s? Well, this question sets up the ultimate ideological clash of the late 20th century. We're talking about a massive swing from a deeply expansive government to a powerful conservative pushback.
Back in the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson championed the Great Society. This vastly expanded the government's role to fight poverty, creating huge programs like Medicare and Medicaid. But by the 1980s, we see a sharp pivot with President Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics. This policy argued for the exact opposite approach: lower taxes, less regulation, and seriously cutting government spending. Impartially speaking, supporters of Reaganomics celebrated the economic boosts and the job creation it fostered, while critics pointed to a rising national debt and growing wealth inequality. Really, it's a debate over government size that still completely defines our political parties today.
And you know, those intense debates over government intervention were put to the ultimate test during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. This was a massive economic crisis triggered by a housing market crash and incredibly risky bank loans. To prevent a total economic depression, the federal government was forced to step in heavily once again. They injected a massive stimulus package into the economy just to stabilize the financial system.
This whole question of government involvement extends directly into modern healthcare, too. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, passed. This directly expanded access to health insurance and made it illegal to deny coverage based on pre-existing conditions. But hey, remember our earlier chat about the baby boom? Well, that aging generation ties directly back to today's healthcare challenges, putting real pressure on the long-term funding for Social Security and Medicare. It's just a perfect example of how yesterday's demographics become today's political hurdles. Which brings us to our final point, and a really big question for you to consider. With all these shifting demographics, the massive expansion of rights, and the ongoing economic debates we've just mapped out, how will your civic engagement shape the next chapter of American history? Voting, activism, volunteering, these aren't just vocabulary words on a screen. They are the exact, literal tools citizens use to build the history we just studied. So it's up to you to decide what goes on the next slide. Keep learning, stay focused, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.